A Werewolf Shifter Romance. Written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Solitude Among Wolves. The forest held her like a secret it refused to share. Vera moved through the darkness with the certainty of something born to it, her platinum hair nearly invisible against the canopy of pines that stretched endlessly in every direction. 10 years had taught her the language of shadows, the way the wind carried information through branches, the precise moment when prey became aware of her presence. 10 years of learning to survive in a world that had rejected her before she even understood what rejection meant. She was hunting when the air changed. The scent came first. Pine and something metallic, something wild and ancient and overwhelmingly wrong. Vera froze mid-stride, her muscle memory triggering instincts that predated conscious thought. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, uneasy and alert. Power radiated through the forest like heat from a forge, and every creature with sense enough to breathe had already fled into the deepest shadows. The temperature of the night seemed to drop, and even the wind stilled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation. 30 wolves emerged from the mist. For a heartbeat that did not belong to her, the circle breathed with her. It was nothing, less than a flinch, more than coincidence. But Vera felt the wolves' rhythm stutter, as if an unseen hand had brushed the fur the wrong way. A few paws faltered on stone, breath catching in a single shared pause before discipline snapped back into place. She told herself she'd imagined it. The forest told her otherwise. They were massive, their fur pristine white like freshly fallen snow, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that transcended animal instinct. Vera recognized them instantly for what they were, shifters in their true forms, not the common predators that roamed these territories. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe steadily through her nose. Running would only prove she was prey. Fighting would prove she was foolish. Neither option offered salvation. She held her ground as they formed a circle around her, a perfect enclosure of teeth and muscle and power that made even her enhanced senses scream for submission. Every fiber of her being demanded she lower herself, present her throat, acknowledge the hierarchy that governed her kind. The compulsion was almost physical in its intensity, a chain wrapped around her spine pulling her downward. But something else stirred within her. Something that refused to bow. Something that had been honed by 10 years of solitude and survival. For the last decade, Vera had lived according to her own rules. She had hunted when hungry, slept when tired, and answered to no one. The memory of her rejection, the moment when everyone she had known had turned against her, still burned, but the years had transformed that burn into something else. Not acceptance, never that, but a kind of armor. A recognition that she did not need anyone who could cast her out so easily. The wolves moved closer, their breathing synchronized, their movement coordinated with a precision that spoke of military discipline. These were not wild creatures acting on instinct. These were soldiers, trained, commanded, deadly in their efficiency. Then the largest wolf shifted. The transformation was fluid, bone and sinew rearranging with a grace that spoke of centuries of practice. Where the white beast had stood, a man now emerged, and Vera's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, impossibly tall, with dark hair that fell across features carved from something harder than stone. A scar tracked down his left jaw, a map of violence survived and overcome. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of winter sky, and when they fixed on her, she felt the full weight of his attention, like a physical force pressing against her chest. "You are exactly as I imagined," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. It was a voice accustomed to obedience, to having its words treated as law. Vera's hands clenched into fists, her nails bit into her palms, and she welcomed the small pain. It kept her grounded. It reminded her that this was real, and not some fever dream conjured by isolation and loneliness. "Who are you?" "Someone who has been looking for you for a very long time." "Baidza." He took a step closer, and the wolves tightened their circle in response, moving with him as if they were extensions of his will. "Did you think you could hide in these woods forever? Did you imagine your solitude would protect you indefinitely?" She didn't answer. The smart play was to assess, to gather information, to calculate odds of survival. But fear and rage churned within her in equal measure. Fear of the unknown. Rage at having her refuge violated by someone powerful enough to find her when she had worked so hard to remain hidden. "My name is Aldor," the man continued. "I am Alpha King of these territories, and you are coming with me. That is not negotiable." The words landed like a sentence. Vera had heard stories in the years when she still lived near civilization. Whispers of an Alpha King who ruled multiple packs, who commanded respect across regions. She had hoped those stories were exaggeration, that no single shifter could hold that much power. But looking at this man, at the way the other shifters deferred to him even in their wolf forms, she understood that the rumors had barely scratched the surface of his authority. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady even as her heart threatened to beat through her ribs. Aldor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or satisfaction at meeting resistance he had anticipated. "You misunderstand. This is not a request." He gestured to the wolves surrounding her with a careless wave of his hand. "They have been tracking your scent for 3 days. You have nowhere to run that they cannot find you, nowhere to hide that I cannot reach. The forests of this territory answer to me, Little Omega. Every tree, every stream, every stone. They are all mine." Vera's mind raced through options. She was fast. Her years in the forest had honed her reflexes to something inhuman, pushing past the limitations of her Omega designation. She could shift, dissolve into her wolf form, attempt to break through the circle. But the wolves were positioned too perfectly, each one placed with the precision of a chess master arranging pieces. Any attempt at escape would be exactly that. An attempt, not a success, and failure would only delay the inevitable. "What do you want with me?" she asked, buying time while her mind worked through possibilities. Aldor studied her for a long moment, taking in the scars that crossed her arms and shoulders, reminders of fights with wild predators, with the harsh landscape itself. He observed the raw strength evident in her lean frame, the peculiar combination of fragility and ferocity. He took in the startling paleness of her skin and the ethereal white of her hair, features that marked her as different, even among her own kind. "That is a question I have been asking myself all these years." The question kept its own calendar. "If you refuse," Aldor said quietly, as if reading her thoughts with an intimacy that violated something fundamental within her, "I will carry you myself. You may make this difficult or simple, but the outcome remains unchanged. You are finished living in the forest, Little Omega. That life is over." The word hung in the air like a curse. Omega. It was what she was, what the forest had helped her nearly forget for 10 years of solitude. It was the thing that made her weak in the eyes of her kind, the thing that had forced her to kneel before others, who saw her as nothing more than a vessel to be used and discarded. Hearing it spoken aloud from the mouth of someone as powerful as this man, someone who wore his authority like a second skin, ignited something desperate within her. Vera raised her chin, drawing on reserves of defiance she hadn't known she still possessed. "My name is Vera, not Little Omega. Not responsibility. Vera, if you are going to take me from the only home I have known in the last 10 years, at least have the courtesy to use my name." Aldor's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across his features. "I know," he said. "I have always known. Your name, your history, your scars. I have known everything about you for 10 years. The implication that he had learned her name, her identity, her nature in meticulous detail, somehow made everything worse. It meant this was not a chance encounter. It meant he had been seeking her specifically, watching her, gathering intelligence about her life while she moved through the forest, believing herself invisible. It meant her solitude had been an illusion, a carefully maintained fiction that had crumbled the moment his wolves appeared. She shifted then, letting her body collapse into the wolf form that came more naturally to her than the human shape ever had. Her fur was white as snow, nearly translucent in the moonlight, and when she ran, it was with the desperation of something finally understanding that all her careful survival had led to this moment, this capture, this inevitable surrender. The circle of white wolves parted just enough to let her through before closing again, matching her pace stride for stride, herding her like she was nothing more than livestock being driven to slaughter. Vera pushed herself faster, her lungs burning with exertion, her muscles screaming in protest, but there was no escape. They moved with her, around her, always there, always present, always reminding her that the game had changed. As the forest gave way to roads, and then to the sight of a castle rising from the darkness, like something out of a nightmare, all sharp angles and imposing stone, Vera understood that whatever her life had been before this moment was over. 10 years of isolation, of carefully constructed safety, of telling herself she was strong enough to survive alone without ever needing anyone. All of it had been leading to this, to captivity, to him, to whatever waited within those stone walls, where the Alpha King who had been watching her for a decade was finally going to explain why she mattered. Chapter 2. Fortress of Stone. The castle emerged from dawn's gray light, like something carved from shadow itself. Vera's eyes adjusted slowly to the transition from forest darkness to the pallid morning that illuminated towering walls of gray stone. The structure rose impossibly high, with turrets that seemed to pierce the sky and narrow windows like watchful eyes observing everything below. She had been transported through the night in partial consciousness, her body too exhausted from the chase to maintain full awareness, though her wolf remained vigilant throughout the journey, cataloging scents and sounds and threats. Aldor had not touched her after she shifted. Instead, his wolves had simply guided her forward, their presence a constant reminder that escape was neither possible nor desired by her captors. When her legs finally gave out from pure exhaustion, 2 of them had flanked her, supporting her weight without malice, treating her with a care that seemed almost contradictory given their purpose. She had processed this contradiction silently, too tired to resist, too broken to plan. Now, standing in what appeared to be a private chamber within the castle walls, Vera felt the full weight of captivity settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. The room was enormous by any standard, with high ceilings that disappeared into shadow and stone walls that stretched upward in dizzying succession. A single window, tall and narrow, revealed the courtyard below where her wolf form had been left behind like discarded clothing. The chamber itself was luxurious in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. A massive bed dominated one corner, its frame carved from dark wood and draped in fabrics that looked as soft as clouds. Beside it stood a wardrobe of polished wood, its doors carved with intricate designs she didn't have the energy to examine. A mirror of polished metal hung on the opposite wall, and Vera approached it with dread pooling in her stomach. The reflection that stared back at her was barely recognizable as human. Her skin was translucent white, almost luminescent in the pale morning light filtering through the window. Her hair fell past her shoulders in a tangle of white strands, matted with forest debris and the residue of her transformation. The scars that crossed her arms and shoulders were stark against her pale skin, evidence of a decade spent fighting for survival in an unforgiving environment. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her cheekbones were prominent enough to suggest she was half-starved. She looked like a ghost. She looked like exactly what she was, a creature rejected by her own kind, surviving on the margins of civilization and nature both. The door to the chamber opened without warning. Vera spun, immediately adopting a defensive stance, but the man who entered was elderly and posed no obvious threat. He had silver hair, and his eyes held a gentleness that seemed incongruous with the power radiating from him. He wore clothes that marked him as someone of significance, quality fabrics, and careful tailoring that spoke of authority and influence. "I am Colton," the man said, offering a slight bow that somehow felt more mocking than respectful. "I serve as advisor to Aldor, and I have been tasked with ensuring your transition to castle life is as smooth as circumstances permit. I should warn you that nothing about this situation will be smooth, but Aldor is determined to try." Vera said nothing. She watched him carefully, cataloging details. The slight tremor in his hands that suggested age, the scars on his forearms that indicated combat experience, the way his eyes assessed her with something that might have been pity. "You will require clothing," Colton continued, moving toward the wardrobe and opening its doors to reveal an array of garments in shades of blue, green, and gray. "Food will be brought to you shortly." There is a bathing chamber through that door, and I strongly suggest you make use of it. The scent of 10 years of forest still clings to you quite heavily. Vera found her voice, though it emerged hoarse from disuse. Why am I here? What does Aldor want with me? Colton turned to face her fully, and something in his expression shifted, became more guarded, more careful. That is a question best posed to the Alpha King himself, but I can tell you this. You are not a prisoner, not precisely. The chambers are yours to inhabit. You have access to the castle library, the gardens, and certain areas designated for your use. You will not leave the castle grounds without escort, but that is a matter of protection, rather than imprisonment. Protection from what? From those who would wish you harm, of course. Your existence is unusual, Vera. Your appearance marks you as something other than ordinary, and in the world of shifters, what is other is often viewed as dangerous. Colton moved toward the door, seeming ready to leave. Bathing facilities are through there, clothing in the wardrobe. Food will arrive within the hour. Should you require anything else, there is a bell pull beside the bed. After he departed, Vera stood motionless for several minutes, processing the combination of civility and captivity that her situation presented. She was a prisoner, clearly, but one being treated with consideration that felt almost insulting in its politeness. She moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard below, where workers moved about their tasks with the orderly precision of a well-run estate. The bathing chamber connected to her room was almost as shocking as the bedroom itself. Hot water flowed from fixtures she didn't recognize when she pulled at certain levers, and the water itself was the cleanest she had encountered in a decade. Vera bathed slowly, almost reverently, washing away the accumulated grime of 10 years in the forest. She watched dirt and forest debris wash away in murky clouds, watched her skin gradually reveal itself as something almost luminescent. The soap smelled of lavender and something else she couldn't identify, and the scent was so overwhelmingly civilized that it made her feel like she was erasing the last traces of her true self. By the time she emerged from the bathing chamber, food had been left on a small table near the window. Bread, cheese, dried meat, and fruit, arranged with a care that suggested someone had anticipated her hunger. She ate mechanically, without tasting anything, her mind still struggling to process the reality of her situation. A knock sounded at the door, as afternoon light began to shift through the window. Before Vera could respond, the door opened to reveal a young woman with brown hair and green eyes. She looked perhaps a year or two older than Vera, with an open expression that seemed almost refreshingly genuine. "I'm Mara," the woman said, stepping into the room with a confidence that suggested she had some standing in this place. "I work as a warrior for Aldor, but I also have been tasked with helping you adjust to life here. I imagine you have questions, and I will do my best to answer them." Vera studied her carefully. Why would Aldor assign someone to help me adjust? What is the purpose of this hospitality? Mara seemed to consider the question carefully before responding. "I should probably tell you that I was born in Moonridge Pack, the same place you were born. I was there when you were rejected. I was only a child at the time, barely able to understand what was happening. But I remember you. I remember the moment they turned their backs on you, and I remember thinking even then that it was wrong." The revelation hit Vera like a physical blow. "You were there? I was too young to understand politics or fear, or the reasons people make the choices they make," Mara continued. "But I remember your face, and I remember feeling confused about why everyone was so afraid. I left Moonridge when I was old enough to make my own choices. I came here to Aldor because I recognized that he was someone with power, and I wanted to serve someone who seemed to understand that fear is not a valid reason for cruelty." Vera found herself studying Mara more carefully now. There was no deception in her expression, no agenda hidden behind polite words. "What does Aldor want with me?" Mara hesitated, and in that hesitation, Vera saw genuine uncertainty. "I don't fully know. What I can tell you is that Aldor does not take mates. He has governed alone for 25 years, without ever accepting a female into his inner circle. He claims it makes him weak, that romantic connection compromises leadership. But your existence seems to have disrupted something within him. I don't have all the answers, Vera. What I can tell you is that you are safe here, and that Aldor's interest in you whatever its nature, is genuine rather than manufactured. Over the following hours, Mara remained in the chamber, showing Vera the layout of the castle that she would be permitted to access. The library was on the second floor, containing thousands of volumes. The gardens occupied a walled courtyard that could be accessed from the main hall. The training grounds where shifters practiced combat were visible from certain vantage points, but were restricted to her. Meals would be taken in her chamber unless she requested otherwise. There were no locks on her door, though the implication was clear that attempting to leave the castle would result in her being returned. As evening descended and Mara prepared to leave, Vera found herself asking the question that had troubled her since the moment of capture. Has Aldor always known where I was? Have I been watched? Mara's expression grew conflicted. Yes. For 10 years you were not truly alone. That knowledge will be difficult, I suspect. But understanding the reason behind that surveillance may help you process it. Aldor found you once, by accident, and something in your essence called to something within him that he has spent his entire adult life trying to suppress. He's been watching you since then, not to harm you, but to understand why you matter to him. After Mara departed, Vera stood alone in her chamber and looked out at the castle grounds disappearing into darkness. The full weight of her reality settled upon her. She was captive, observed, claimed by someone she did not know and did not trust. Yet she was also safe in a way she had not been since childhood. Fed, sheltered, treated with a courtesy that seemed to suggest she possessed value. The paradox of her situation twisted within her. Impossible to reconcile. Chapter 3. Revelations in Archives. 3 days passed before Aldor summoned her. 3 days of silence and solitude, broken only by Mara's visits and meals delivered without conversation. Vera spent her time exploring the library, running her fingers along spines of books that documented centuries of shifter history, culture, and conflict. She read about pack hierarchies and the different territories that govern shifter society. She learned about the Alpha King position, elected every 25 years by the regional alphas, a position of immense power, but also tremendous scrutiny. She found nothing that explained why Aldor had brought her here. When the summons came, delivered by a servant with careful deference, Vera felt her stomach tighten. She had prepared for this moment, and simultaneously hoped it would never arrive. She had spent 3 days constructing walls, convincing herself that whatever Aldor wanted, she could resist it. But as she followed the servant through stone corridors lit by torches, she recognized the fragility of that conviction. Aldor's study was nothing like the comfortable chambers of the castle's public spaces. This room felt like the interior of a fortress within the fortress, walls lined with documents, shelves groaning under the weight of records and reports, a massive desk of dark wood bearing the marks of years of use. Behind that desk sat not only Aldor, but also Colton, and between them lay a leather portfolio sealed with wax, bearing the symbol of Moonridge Pack. Vera, Aldor said, acknowledging her presence with a tilt of his head. I have been waiting for you to be ready for this conversation. I believe that time has come. She said nothing, standing near the door as if proximity to escape might offer her some measure of control. Aldor gestured to a chair positioned across from the desk. Please sit. Vera moved to the chair but remained standing, unwilling to position herself in a posture of submission. She watched as Aldor exchanged a glance with Colton, some silent communication passing between them. I have brought you here, Aldor began carefully, because you deserve to understand your own history. 10 years ago, I received this archive from Moonridge Pack, not from Elian, Colton added, voice gone careful. From Elder Marrow, 2 winters before Elian challenged for Alpha. A dissenter. He feared what the council was becoming and smuggled these records out under formal seal so the truth could not be rewritten later. It documents the proceedings that led to your rejection. I thought perhaps you should see it yourself. Colton placed the leather portfolio between them, within Vera's reach but not forcing her to take it. The decision to show you this documentation is ultimately Aldor's, Colton said quietly, but I support it. Ignorance of one's own history is a particular form of cruelty. Vera's hands trembled as she reached for the portfolio. Inside lay meticulously organized documents, dates, names, decisions recorded in formal script. She began to read, and with each line, a new layer of understanding settled over her like ash. The documents detailed a formal gathering of Moonridge Pack elders, called specifically to address her existence following her first transformation. The language was clinical, detached, describing her appearance as markedly aberrant, and her emergence as a shifter as unexpected and concerning. Then she found the names, lists of those who had voted to separate her from the pack, and among them, in clear, deliberate handwriting, Sienna. Her mother had not simply allowed the rejection. She had actively participated in it. The realization was a physical blow, and Vera sank into the chair without conscious decision, her vision blurring as she read and reread her mother's name on the document. Your mother, Aldor said quietly, was afraid. Fear is powerful, Vera, and it drives people to do things they would not otherwise do. She was afraid of me? The words emerged broken. She was afraid of what your existence meant for her standing in the pack. Aldor corrected. Your appearance marked you as different. Difference is threatening to those who have built their lives on conformity. Your mother chose conformity over her child. Vera turned the page and found herself staring at a name that carried different weight. Elian. The documents revealed that at 32 years old, Elian had been the primary advocate for the separation. His arguments were recorded in detail, claims that albino characteristics indicated genetic corruption, that your presence posed a risk to pack integrity and future generations. He had presented a theory, documented in meticulous detail, that albinism was a precursor to some form of supernatural degradation or curse. Elian was 20 years older than you, Colton explained. He held significant influence even then, though he was not yet alpha. His ideology regarding purity of bloodlines was already well established. Vera looked up from the documents. Where is he now? The exchange of glances between Aldor and Colton told her that this question had been anticipated. Elian is currently alpha of Moonridge Pack, Aldor said. He assumed the position 5 years ago, approximately 5 years after your rejection. He seized control through combat challenges to the aging alpha and has since consolidated power through a combination of ideology and political alliance. He is precisely the sort of leader that Moonridge Pack needed according to his own worldview. Someone committed to maintaining what he perceives as purity. Vera's hands clenched on the portfolio. You brought me here to show me that my mother rejected me, and my greatest enemy gained ultimate power. Was this meant to be comforting? No, Aldor said simply. It was meant to be truthful. You deserve to understand what happened and why. Not as justification, but as context. Vera stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the castle courtyard. Why are you telling me this? What is it you want from me? That is the question I have been asking myself for 10 years, Aldor replied. His tone carried something that might have been confession, or might have been calculation. She could not determine which. I encountered you once, at the edge of my territory. You were hunting. You were magnificent, deadly in your focus, precise in your movements. Your scent was unlike anything I had encountered before or since. It called to something within me that I have spent my entire life suppressing. Vera turned to face him. What do you mean? I mean, Aldor said carefully, that your essence is rarer than you understand. In the archives of shifter history, there are references to a category of Omega that exists almost entirely in myth. They are called listeners. They possess an ancient power, one rooted in genetics so specific that true listeners have not been documented for nearly 300 years. The power allows them to subjugate other shifters through command of voice, a neurological domination that overrides even alpha authority. Vera wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Instead, she found herself asking, why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand what you are, Aldor said. You have been told your entire life that your albinism marks you as defective, as cursed, as something to be feared. But your appearance is not a curse. It is a marker. It indicates ancient genetics, powerful genetics. You are not the problem, Vera. You are the solution to a problem that alphas have been struggling with for generations. A solution? Vera's voice was sharp with skepticism. To what problem? To the problem of control, Aldor replied. Of ensuring that power remains balanced. Listeners were created, in the most primal sense, to prevent any single alpha from becoming too powerful. Your very existence is a counterweight to authority run amok. Vera moved back to the desk and looked directly at Aldor. And what do you intend to do with this counterweight? Aldor met her gaze steadily. That depends entirely on what you choose. But first, you must understand what you are capable of. I propose to train you, to teach you to recognize and control the power that flows through your veins. Train me how? Vera asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. By teaching you to transform on command, rather than through instinct or stress, Aldor explained. Most shifters of your category have little control over when they shift. But listeners, if the historical texts are accurate, should be capable of deliberate, intentional transformation. Are you willing to attempt this? Vera considered the implications. Training meant increased proximity to Aldor. It meant acknowledging that some part of her might actually be valuable in ways she had never considered. It meant potentially discovering abilities that terrified her, because power itself was terrifying. Yes, she said finally, but on one condition. Aldor raised an eyebrow. You are in no position to negotiate conditions. Then I refuse, Vera said flatly. You say I am rare and valuable. You say my abilities are crucial. Then you can teach me willingly with my consent, or you can attempt to force me. But forcing me will not result in effective training. Choice matters. Power matters more when it is chosen. For a long moment, Aldor simply studied her. Then something shifted in his expression. A recognition, perhaps, or a reassessment. What is your condition? That you explain why you truly brought me here. Not the theoretical reasons about power or genetic significance. The real reason. Why am I here, Aldor? Aldor stood and moved to the window beside her. Because 10 years of watching you from a distance was not sufficient. Because your rejection from everything you should have belonged to mirrors my own complicated relationship with power and belonging. Because when I look at you, I see something I have not seen in another living being for decades. Potential. Not potential to be used, but potential to be understood. The honesty of the answer disarmed her more effectively than any flattery could have. Understood how? By allowing you to become what you were always meant to be, Aldor said. By teaching you that your difference is not weakness, but strength. By showing you that the world you rejected, you does not define your value. Will you allow me to try? Vera looked at the documents spread across the desk, at her mother's signature condemning her, at the evidence of Elian's ideology that had shaped her rejection. Then she looked back at Aldor. Yes, she said, I will try. Chapter 4. Strength. Forged in repetition. The training grounds existed beneath the castle in chambers carved from living rock, torches casting dancing shadows across walls that had absorbed decades of exertion and strain. Vera's first day of formal training began at dawn. Though the underground facility existed in perpetual twilight that made time meaningless, Aldor had assigned her to work with a warrior named Corvin, a man with a scar that split his left eye in half, and a demeanor that suggested he took no pleasure in his assignment, but would execute it with absolute precision. You will not transform today, Corvin had instructed, his voice carrying the flatness of someone who had delivered variations of these words countless times before. Today is about understanding your body in human form. Strength without transformation is foundation. Transformation without foundation is chaos. The first week was agony disguised as instruction. Corvin taught her stance and balance, forcing her to hold positions until her muscles trembled with strain. He taught her how to move her weight through her hips rather than her shoulders, how to keep her spine aligned during strikes, how to breathe in patterns that sustained rather than depleted. She had survived 10 years in the forest through instinct, but instinct was not technique. Technique was the difference between a warrior and an animal, and Corvin was determined to bridge that gap. By the second week, Vera could feel her body changing. Muscles she did not know existed began to define themselves. Her movements became more precise, less wasteful. When Corvin paired her with one of Aldor's younger warriors for sparring, she managed to land 3 strikes before being thrown to the ground. It was hardly a victory, but it was evidence of progress. Mara appeared during the 3rd week of training, taking a position alongside her during the morning conditioning exercises. They ran through corridors carrying weighted packs, climbed ropes suspended from the ceiling, moved through patterns of combat that Corvin called the foundations. Mara was stronger than Vera, more refined in her technique, but she never made it seem effortless. She grunted with exertion like everyone else, sweat marking her training clothes the same as Vera's. "How long have you been training?" Vera asked during one of their rare moments of rest. "Since I left Moonridge," Mara replied, breathing heavily. 8 years of this. Some days I still feel like I'm beginning." She paused, then added quietly, "I was never as fast as you naturally are, but technique can be learned. Your speed is wasted without understanding how to direct it." By week 4, Corvin introduced her to weapons. The sword was heavier than she expected, requiring a completely different balance than the weight of her own body. The bow demanded precision and patience. The staff required an understanding of momentum and leverage. Vera approached each with the same intensity she brought to hand-to-hand combat, driven by something she did not fully understand, a need to prove that the years of isolation had not left her weak. On the 15th day of training, as she was returning to her chambers bathed in exhaustion, a servant intercepted her with a message. Mara was waiting in the library with important news. Vera's heart rate accelerated, though she could not have explained why. She took a moment to wash the grime from her face, and then made her way to the library, where she found Mara sitting in the reading room surrounded by stacks of documents. "I received a message from my mother in Moonridge," Mara said without preamble. "She writes regularly, and this time she included information I thought you should know. About your mother, Sienna." Vera felt something tighten in her chest. She had spent the past 2 weeks trying not to think about the revelations in Aldor's study, trying to focus instead on the work of rebuilding her body and understanding her potential. "What about her?" "She is dead," Mara said gently. "She has been dead for 3 years. My mother wrote that Sienna became increasingly isolated after your rejection. Elian, he made her life difficult. He accused her of contaminating the bloodline, of being responsible for your existence. He turned the pack against her systematically, and she withdrew further and further until eventually she stopped leaving her dwelling. When my mother's group finally checked on her, she had been gone for weeks." Vera sat down abruptly, her legs refusing to support her weight. She had constructed narratives about her mother over the years, stories in which Sienna eventually realized her mistake, in which she searched the forest for her daughter, in which reunion was possible. The finality of death obliterated all those narratives at once. "There is more," Mara continued carefully. "Before she died, Sienna apparently spoke to a few people she trusted. She said that Elian had pursued her relentlessly after your rejection, blaming her for bearing a cursed child. He told her that the bloodline was contaminated, and that she should never have allowed you to live. My mother believes this pursuit contributed significantly to Sienna's decline." Vera's hands clenched into fists. She was weak. She allowed fear to destroy her. "Yes," Mara agreed. "But she was also human, Vera. And she was afraid. That does not excuse her choices, but it explains them. She was rejected by the pack for having given birth to you. Then she was persecuted for that same act by Elian. She had no one to turn to, no support, no way out. The similarity to her own situation was too obvious to ignore. Vera had survived her rejection through isolation and strength of will. Her mother had survived it through capitulation and ultimate withdrawal. They had both been victims of Elian's ideology, just in different ways. That recognition did not absolve Sienna, but it complicated Vera's anger in ways that felt dangerous. "I need to be alone," Vera said finally. She returned to her chamber and sat by the window as night fell across the castle grounds. She thought about her mother, a woman whose name she had only recently relearned, who had rejected her out of fear and then suffered for that rejection in ways that ultimately destroyed her. She thought about the cycle that Elian had created, fear leading to rejection, leading to persecution, leading to destruction. She thought about whether her survival constituted strength or simply stubborn refusal to surrender. When Aldor found her there hours later, she did not startle at his presence. She seemed to have been expecting him. "Mara told you," he said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "Yes, I am sorry," Aldor said. "You deserved to know sooner. But you deserved to know in a way that allowed you to process it without interference. Vera looked up at him. My mother was weak, but her weakness was created by people like Elian. People who weaponized fear and ideology to gain power. She could not survive that pressure. I can. That is the only real difference between us. No, Aldor said quietly. The difference is that you had 10 years to find yourself before being confronted with this knowledge. Your mother had only moments before Elian's pressure overwhelmed her. You may have survived better than she did, but that does not make you stronger than her. It makes you lucky. Vera wanted to reject that assessment, but she could not. Luck had saved her. Luck that she had fled before Elian consolidated enough power to hunt her down. Luck that Aldor had found her first. Her mother had not been so fortunate. What happens next? She asked. Next, Aldor replied. You continue to train. You continue to become who you were always meant to be. And when the time comes, when you understand your full potential, you will make choices about your own future. Not choices made from fear, but choices made from power. That evening, Vera returned to the training grounds on her own and worked through the patterns Corvin had taught her until her muscles burned with pure exhaustion. She was not weak like her mother. She would not be destroyed by Elian's ideology. She would become something that no amount of fear-mongering could diminish. She would become a force that changed the equation entirely. Chapter 5. The Weight of Ultimatum. The messengers arrived on a gray morning when mist clung to the castle grounds like a shroud. Vera first heard the commotion from the training grounds where she was working through combat sequences with Mara, the two of them moving in synchronized patterns that had become almost meditative through repetition. Corvin appeared in the doorway, his scarred face unusually grave. The Alpha King requires your presence, he said simply. And yours as well, Mara. The journey to Aldor's war room felt longer than the corridors actually were. The castle seemed to pulse with tension, servants moving with quick, furtive gestures, guards positioning themselves at strategic intervals. When they entered the chamber, Vera found it crowded with people she had never seen before, men and women who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of authority. Alphas, she realized. Regional leaders gathered in response to something significant. Aldor stood at the head of the room, his expression carved from stone. Colton stood beside him, and the elderly advisor's face held an expression of carefully controlled fury. On the large table before them lay a document sealed with wax bearing the symbol of Moonridge Pack, 3 mountains arranged in a triangle. The ultimatum has been formally delivered, Aldor announced, his voice cutting through the murmured conversations. Elian, Alpha of Moonridge Pack, demands that we surrender Vera within 3 weeks' time. Failure to comply will result in a formal declaration of war against this territory, and all packs allied with us. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Vera felt her breath catch, though she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. 3 weeks. She had been training for approximately 5 weeks, progressing from near helplessness to competence. 3 weeks would give her perhaps 8 weeks total of structured training. It was not nothing, but it was far from sufficient preparation for anything involving actual combat against someone like Elian. One of the alphas stepped forward. A woman with silver streaked through her dark hair and eyes that held ancient calculation. We need to discuss the political ramifications, she said. Elian claims that your harboring of an albino omega constitutes endangerment to the genetic integrity of our species. He is arguing that this justifies a formal challenge to your authority as Alpha King. If we do not respond decisively, other packs will begin questioning your fitness to lead. Elian has been constructing this narrative for years, another alpha interjected, a younger man with the bearing of someone still proving himself. His ideology regarding purity has attracted followers from at least 9 regional packs. If he consolidates those followers into a formal coalition, we face genuine threat of civil war among the pack hierarchy. Vera watched Aldor's face as he listened to these assessments. She could see the weight of leadership pressing against him, the calculation of lives balanced against political necessity. He was not simply dealing with a personal obsession anymore. He was navigating the complex politics of an entire civilization. What are our military options? Aldor asked Colton. War is devastating regardless of outcome, Colton replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. If we win militarily, We face years of rebuilding and loss of life that will destabilize the entire region. If we lose the kingdom itself. Neither option is acceptable. Then we pursue negotiation, suggested the female alpha. We could offer concessions. Perhaps Vera's exile instead of death. Perhaps integration into a neutral territory where she poses no ideological threat. Vera felt something harden within her at those words. She was being discussed as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a person with agency. She was being positioned as a sacrifice on the political chessboard, a pawn to be moved or removed as calculation demanded. After the council dispersed, Vera found herself alone with Aldor in a smaller chamber adjacent to the war room. She had no memory of being led there, only of finding herself in a room with him while evening light filtered through narrow windows. "I will leave," she said without preamble. "I will go away from here, and the political problem disappears. Elian has no leverage if I am gone." Aldor turned to face her, and she saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "If you leave, I become weak. I become someone who can be moved through pressure and threat. Every alpha in this region will begin testing my resolve, pushing boundaries, demanding concessions. The stability I have maintained for 25 years collapses into chaos." "Then let it collapse," Vera said harshly. "My existence is not worth the death of countless shifters in a war." "No," Aldor agreed. "But your life is worth the preservation of order that protects millions of shifters across multiple territories. You do not understand the mathematics of power, Vera. Sometimes the cost of protecting one person is the prevention of greater catastrophe." Vera wanted to argue, wanted to reject the utilitarian calculus that positioned her as either sacrifice or savior, depending on political convenience. But she understood, even through her resistance, that he was speaking truth. Power operated according to logic that transcended individual desires or moral absolutes. "What do you intend to do?" she asked instead. "I intend to give you 8 weeks instead of 5 to prepare," Aldor said quietly. "I intend to propose to the council that you face Elian in formal combat. If you defeat him, the ideological foundation of his movement collapses. His followers lose faith in his certainty. The threat of war diminishes dramatically. You want me to fight Elian." The words emerged flat, factual. "I want you to have the opportunity to reclaim your own narrative," Aldor corrected. "To prove, not to anyone else but to yourself, that your rejection was not justified, that your existence is not weakness." Vera moved to the window and looked out at the castle grounds disappearing into twilight. "If I fight him and lose, you have a war on your hands anyway. If I fight him and win, I become a weapon that other alphas will want to use. Either way, my agency becomes secondary to political utility." "Yes," Aldor said. And the honesty of that admission was somehow more reassuring than any false promise could have been. "But you have agency in this moment. You can choose to accept this path or refuse it. I am not forcing you to fight. I am offering you the option." Vera considered the choice before her with cold clarity. She could leave and live as a fugitive, constantly pursued by Elian and others who viewed her existence as threatening. She could stay and become a pawn in Aldor's political games. Or she could choose a third path. She could train, prepare, and meet Elian on a field of combat where her power, whatever it actually was, could be tested against his ideology. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "I have conditions. Name them. First, the training intensifies. I need 8 weeks of focused preparation, not 5. Second, if I win, I am freed from any further obligation to you or this kingdom. I can choose my own path. Third, if I lose, Elian does not execute me. He exiles me, nothing more." Aldor nodded slowly. "The first condition is acceptable. The second is acceptable. The third I cannot guarantee, as it would be Elian's choice to make. But I can declare it as the terms of formal combat. And if he refuses to accept them, it speaks to the legitimacy of his claims to be fighting for anything other than power. Then we have an agreement," Vera said. That evening, Mara found her in the library, surrounded by texts documenting combat techniques and the historical records of pack conflicts. "I heard the council discussion," Mara said without preamble. "You are going to fight Elian." "Yes," He is skilled, Mara said, sitting beside her. He is experienced, but he is also arrogant. He believes so completely in the correctness of his ideology that he sometimes underestimates opponents who do not share his certainty. That arrogance could be a weakness. Can you teach me? Vera asked. Teach you what? Everything you know about him. Every technique he favors. Every pattern in his combat style. Everything that might give me an advantage. Mara smiled then, and it was a smile that held genuine warmth. I thought you might ask that. I have already begun documenting what I remember from my time in Moonridge. We will spend the next 8 weeks preparing you, and we will make certain that when you face him, you are not fighting an ideology. You are fighting a man with weaknesses and fears like any other. That night, Vera returned to the training grounds alone. She moved through the patterns Corvin had taught her, but now with new purpose. She was no longer training to prove her value to others. She was training to reclaim her own narrative. She was training to face the man who had rejected her not once, but repeatedly through his persecution of her mother. She was training to prove that the weakness he had attributed to her was a fiction created by his own fear. The work was no longer simply physical conditioning. It had become something more fundamental, a reclamation of self that Vera had surrendered 10 years ago in the forest. She would fight Elian, and regardless of outcome, she would face him as Vera, not an Omega, not an abomination, not a political problem, simply herself. Chapter 6. The Listener Awakens. 8 weeks compressed into a crucible of focused intensity. The weeks following Aldor's council declaration transformed from the routine structure of physical training into something far more esoteric and demanding. Vera found herself moving through the castle grounds in daylight hours, visible to the warriors and servants who populated the stronghold. No longer a ghost haunting the shadows, but a presence that demanded acknowledgement. The change was calculated and deliberate. Aldor had declared publicly that she would fight Elian, and hiding her now would only undermine the legitimacy of that declaration. The specialized training began in earnest during the second week of the 8-week countdown. Corvin still directed her physical preparation, but now he shared the training grounds with Aldor himself, who introduced an entirely different dimension of instruction. Where Corvin focused on technique and conditioning, Aldor addressed something far more abstract: the neurological pathways that supposedly allowed a listener to subjugate other shifters through voice alone. The power is not in your voice, Aldor explained during one of their early sessions. The two of them standing alone in the underground training chamber as afternoon light filtered through narrow windows positioned high in the stone walls. Your voice is merely the conduit. The actual power exists in your nervous system, in the way your essence communicates directly with the essence of other shifters. It is neurological domination, not magical compulsion. Vera listened carefully, her mind working through the implications. How do I access this if it has never manifested before? Through visualization and intentionality. Aldor replied. Come here. He guided her through an exercise that felt almost meditative. She was instructed to close her eyes and imagine her essence, the thing that made her fundamentally shifter, extending outward like tendrils of consciousness, seeking connection with other living beings. Initially, it felt ridiculous, like a child's game of pretend. But gradually, after repeated attempts across multiple sessions, she began to feel something shifting within her perception. The sensation was subtle at first, a tingling at the base of her skull that intensified when she focused her concentration. Aldor brought other shifters into the training chamber, warriors who would stand motionless while she attempted to project her will onto their consciousness. The first attempts yielded nothing but frustration. But by the 4th day of this specialized training, something changed. A young warrior named Theron suddenly stiffened mid-breath, his body going rigid as if seized by invisible hands. The effect lasted only seconds before releasing him, but the fundamental principle had been proven. The power existed, and it could be accessed. You felt it, Aldor said, not as a question, but a statement of fact. That moment when you reached outward and his resistance crumbled. That is what you are truly capable of. The following days involved refining that initial manifestation, practicing with different warriors, learning to modulate the intensity of the compulsion. A command could be gentle suggestion or absolute domination, depending on how much force Vera channeled through her consciousness. The control was paramount. Aldor was emphatic about this. Power without control was merely chaos wearing the mask of strength. Mara intensified her role during this period, becoming Vera's constant companion and closest confidant. They trained together through the morning hours, moved through combat sequences in the afternoon, and spent evenings studying the documented techniques that Mara had compiled regarding Elian's combat patterns. It was during one of these evening sessions, as they sat in Mara's private quarters reviewing notes, that Mara finally revealed the burden she had been carrying. "Elian contacted me," Mara said quietly, not meeting Vera's eyes. "He sent a messenger to the castle 3 weeks ago. He offered me something in exchange for convincing you to leave." Vera's entire body tensed. "What did he offer you?" "Protection for my mother," Mara replied, her voice hollow. "Elian told the messenger that if I could persuade you to leave the castle, my family would be guaranteed safety and standing in Moonridge Pack. If you fought him and won, he promised that my mother would face consequences for my betrayal. Did you consider it?" The question emerged sharper than Vera intended. "For approximately 30 seconds, Mara admitted. "And then I realized something. My mother raised me to be loyal. She raised me to understand that fear is not a legitimate reason for cruelty. She would rather face Elian's consequences than have me become someone who betrays friendship for safety. I refused his offer and reported it to Aldor. That was the information that allowed him to accelerate the timeline of your preparation." Vera reached out and gripped Mara's hand. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet," Mara said. "Wait until after you have faced him and survived." The night before the scheduled confrontation, Vera found herself unable to sleep. She moved through the castle corridors with the quiet grace that training had instilled, eventually making her way to the highest tower where the night wind carried the scent of distant forests. She was standing there, wrapped in a cloak against the evening chill, when Aldor found her. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside her, surveying the landscape as she did. 2 figures silhouetted against stars that seemed impossibly distant and cold. "You can leave," he said finally. "I mean what I told the council. If you choose to refuse this confrontation, I will not stop you. You can walk away from the castle tonight, and I will ensure that Elian is informed that you left of your own volition. The political consequences will be mine to navigate." Vera considered the offer with genuine weight. She could disappear into the night, return to the forest, resume the life of isolation she had known before. She could escape the uncertainty of combat, the vulnerability of exposure, the terror of failure, but she also understood, with complete clarity, what such escape would cost. "No," she said. "I am done running. I was running when I fled Moonridge at 15. I was running when I hid in the forest for 10 years. I will not run again." Aldor reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and grounding. This was not a gesture of possession or claim. This was simply human contact, acknowledgement of her choice and validation of her strength. They stood together as the night deepened, neither of them requiring words to communicate what had shifted between them. By the time morning approached and they returned to the castle, something fundamental had changed. Vera was no longer Aldor's responsibility or his obsession. She was simply Vera, and she had chosen her own path. Colton found her in the library as dawnlight began to filter through the windows. The old advisor looked diminished somehow, as if the weight of everything had finally begun to press against him visibly. "You know that Aldor violated your privacy by monitoring you for 10 years, Colton said without preamble. "You know that this protection was, in many ways, possession masquerading as care." "Yes," Vera acknowledged. "I have known this for some time." "And you remain here despite this knowledge," Colton continued. "Despite understanding the true nature of what occurred between you and Aldor. My choice is my own now," Vera said firmly. "I remain because I choose to remain. I train because I choose to train. I will face Elian because I choose to face him. Aldor no longer controls this, if he ever truly did. The monitoring, the protection, the obsession, those were his failings. But I refuse to allow his failings to define my response to what I am capable of becoming." Colton nodded slowly. and something that might have been approval flickered across his weathered features. "Then you are ready. More ready than any of us anticipated when this began." Chapter 7. The Albino's Triumph. A herald stepped between the lines and read the terms twice over. Old law formalities that left no room for theater. No auxiliaries, no poisons, no second strikes upon submission. Should Vera fall, her penalty would be exile only, witnessed and recorded. Should Elian fall, he would forfeit title and lands and accept exile under the same seal. Both parties gave assent before the gathered alphas. The confrontation was set for neutral ground, a forest clearing equidistant from Aldor's territory and Moonridge packlands. The ancient trees had witnessed centuries of pack conflicts, their bark scarred by centuries of disputes resolved through combat and dominance. Vera arrived at dawn, Aldor and a contingent of his warriors accompanying her to the clearing's edge. The regional alphas had sent representatives to observe, ensuring that whatever transpired would be documented and acknowledged across all territories. Elian stood on the opposite side of the clearing, his massive frame radiating the confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. Behind him stood his followers, shifters from multiple packs who had pledged their support to his ideology of genetic purity. Vera had not slept the night before. Instead, she had moved through visualization exercises that Aldor had taught her, imagining the confrontation from every conceivable angle. She had meditated on her power, on the weight of her own essence, on the neurological domination that she had practiced for weeks. She had prepared not just her body but her mind, the part of her that would need to remain calm and focused when Elian attempted to overwhelm her through physical force and alpha authority. "You look well," Elian called across the clearing, his voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. "The castle has treated you kindly, Vera. A shame it will all end today when you return to us as prisoner instead of guest." Vera did not respond. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, and saw beneath the confidence to the fear that drove his ideology. She saw a man terrified of anything he could not control or categorize. She saw someone whose power was built entirely on the acceptance of his worldview by others. If that acceptance crumbled, so did everything he had constructed. "You were there," Vera said finally, her voice steady, "when I was rejected, when everyone turned their backs. You were the one who convinced them that my existence was a threat. You persecuted my mother until she died alone. You built an entire movement on fear of things you do not understand. That ends today." Elian's expression darkened. "You are right that it ends. It ends with your death or your submission. Choose." Both of them shifted simultaneously. The transformation was almost beautiful in its terrible synchronization. Vera's white form emerging from flesh and bone, Elian's massive frame erupting into a wolf of dark brown and gray. He was larger than her, with the bulk of an alpha who had spent decades consolidating power and physical dominance. But Vera had something that physical size could not diminish. She had trained with intention. She had learned control. She had discovered the power that lay dormant within her genetic code. Elian attacked immediately, expecting the psychological pressure of his dominance to overwhelm her. He lunged with teeth bared, his body a dark missile of muscle and predatory intent. Vera twisted with the fluid grace that had been honed through weeks of combat training. She moved not away from his attack, but through it, using his momentum against him, her smaller frame sliding past his bulk with precision. As he passed, she slammed her body sideways into his flank, driving the air from his lungs. He recovered with the experience of 100 fights, rolling and spinning to face her again. They danced through the clearing in a deadly choreography, strike and counter, feint and evasion. Vera's speed was extraordinary, but Elian's strength was undeniable. Each time they clashed, he drove her backward. Each time she dodged, he came again with renewed fury. The witnesses from both sides watched in silence, their breathing synchronizing with the movements on the forest floor. After 3 minutes that felt like hours, Vera understood that physical combat alone would not defeat him. He was simply too experienced, too powerful. She had known this was likely. She had prepared accordingly. Vera stopped moving. She planted her wolf form firmly on the ground and looked directly into Elian's eyes. For a moment, he seemed confused by the cessation of movement. And in that moment of confusion, she reached out with her consciousness. Not her voice, not her physical form, but the neurological essence that defined what she was as a listener. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Elian's entire body seized as if struck by lightning. Every muscle locked simultaneously in response to the command flowing through her consciousness into his. He could not move, could not shift back to human form, could not fight against the absolute domination that had been encoded into his nervous system. He was frozen, a statue of wolf flesh paralyzed by will alone. Vera approached him slowly, deliberately, making certain that every witness observed what was happening. She was not attacking. She was not consuming him. She was simply demonstrating the truth through action. She was showing them all that his ideology was built on false premises, that Albino was not weak. That difference was not threat, that his certainty was built on ignorance. She released him after long moments, allowing his body to collapse into the forest floor. Elian remained there, gasping, unable to comprehend what had occurred. His followers stood paralyzed by realization. They had witnessed an Omega subjugate their Alpha without laying a physical blow. They had seen power that transcended their understanding of hierarchy and dominance. Aldor stepped forward then, his presence commanding absolute attention. Elian has been defeated in formal combat before witnesses from multiple territories. By the terms you yourself accepted, you are exiled from all Pack territories. You will leave these lands and never return. Attempt to do so, and execution will be the consequence. You are no longer Alpha of Moonridge Pack. You are nothing. The declaration hung in the air like a sentence of death, despite Aldor sparing Elian's life. Within moments, the followers who had stood behind him began to disperse. They had come believing in his certainty, in the purity of his ideology. What they had witnessed shattered that belief. Without their support, Elian was simply a defeated warrior, with nothing remaining. Vera shifted back to human form and found Aldor waiting with clothing and warmth. The regional alphas approached her, their expressions mixed between caution and newfound respect. "The shifter world has changed today," one of them said, a weathered woman named Thrace who commanded 3 Pack territories. "We will need to revise our understanding of what listeners represent. You are not threats to stability. You are perhaps stabilizing forces we have failed to recognize." Vera nodded, too exhausted for extensive words. As she and Aldor made their way back toward his territory, she understood that everything had shifted fundamentally. Elian's movement had collapsed not through violence, but through exposure. His ideology had met reality and been found wanting. The followers who had supported him out of fear would now seek new leaders, new ideologies, new certainties. The battle was won. The larger work, rebuilding what had been broken, helping her mother's people find their way toward understanding rather than fear, that work was just beginning. But for the first time in her life, Vera faced that future not as an outcast or a victim, but as someone who had reclaimed her own power. Chapter 8. Home Reclaimed. The week following Elian's defeat passed in a strange suspension between what had been and what would become. Vera found herself celebrated by Aldor's warriors, acknowledged by the regional alphas, and yet strangely untethered from the certainty that such recognition should have provided. She had fought for her freedom and had won it, yet the victory felt incomplete without understanding what came next. The confrontation had resolved the external conflict, but the internal landscape remained unmapped territory. Aldor found her on the castle's highest tower on the 7th evening after her victory, standing at the edge where wind howled up from the valleys below. He did not approach immediately, but simply stood nearby, allowing her to acknowledge his presence in her own time. "I want to offer you something," Aldor said finally. "A ritual that exists between 2 listeners, something older than Pack hierarchy, older than the distinctions between Alpha and Omega. It is a private acknowledgement of connection that exists outside all politics and power dynamics." Vera turned to face him. "What kind of ritual?" "A bonding of essence," Aldor explained. 2 consciousnesses recognizing each other at the most fundamental level. It would not bind you to me. It would simply acknowledge that what exists between us is mutual rather than one-directional. The choice is entirely yours, and I will not pressure you toward acceptance. Vera considered the offer with the careful deliberation that had become her way since arriving at the castle. The obsession that had driven Aldor for 10 years remained a complication she could not fully ignore. Yet she also recognized that something genuine had evolved between them through weeks of training, conflict, and mutual exposure. She had learned to trust him in ways that surprised her, not through his words, but through his consistent actions and his willingness to accept her autonomy. "Yes," she said, "I will do this." The private ritual took place that night in a chamber within the castle that Vera had never seen before. It was circular, with walls of smooth stone, and a floor marked with symbols that Colton explained were ancient designations of power and reciprocity. Aldor and Vera stood facing each other in the center, while Colton and Mara witnessed from positions outside the marked circle. There was no elaborate ceremony, no complex incantations. Aldor simply reached out and took her hands, and Vera felt her consciousness extending outward to meet his. For a moment that seemed to exist outside time, they recognized each other at the deepest level, not as Alpha and Omega, not as captor and captured, but as two beings whose essences resonated with compatible frequencies. His obsession was still present. She could feel it, but it had transformed into something else through her resistance and his acceptance of her autonomy. The bond that formed was not chains, but connection. Threads of mutual recognition that could be sustained or severed by either party at any moment. When they separated, Vera felt fundamentally changed in ways she could not articulate. She was no longer alone in the way she had been in the forest, but she was also not consumed by another person's need. The distinction felt crucial. A week later, Aldor presented a formal proposal to the regional alphas and his court. He requested that Vera be recognized publicly as his chosen mate through an ancient ritual that formally bound them before witnesses. The political implications were significant. It declared publicly that he valued her as equal rather than subordinate, that her listener power would be directed toward the stability of his territory through mutual consent rather than obligation. Some alphas expressed reservation about formalizing a relationship with someone born as Omega, but the memory of Vera's victory over Elian remained fresh enough that most recognized the pragmatism of the union. The public ceremony took place in the Great Hall of the castle, with representatives from all the regional territories present. Vera wore formal clothing in shades of silver and white that seemed to respond to her albinism rather than hide it. The ritual itself was surprisingly simple. A formal declaration of mutual choice, an exchange of marks placed on each other's wrists that would be visible for anyone to recognize, and a final acknowledgement before all gathered witnesses. When Aldor drew his wrist past hers, creating a mark that would remain visible as evidence of their bonding, Vera felt not possession, but affirmation. She was choosing this. She was choosing him. And he was acknowledging that her choice mattered more than his own desires. The distinction transformed everything. Weeks after the formal ceremony, Vera stood before a mirror in the chamber that was now hers and Aldor's shared space. She had requested it be redecorated with her input. And slowly the cold stone walls had been softened with tapestries and objects that held meaning to her. She could see the mark on her wrist clearly, the evidence of her bonding visible to anyone who looked. The woman in the mirror was unrecognizable as the semi-feral creature who had arrived at the castle months earlier. Her skin had maintained its translucent pallor, but now it seemed luminescent rather than sickly. Her white hair gleamed with health. Her eyes held clarity and purpose, rather than the desperate vigilance of someone constantly threatened. Most significantly, the scars that marked her body now seemed less like evidence of trauma, and more like badges of survival and transformation. Aldor entered behind her, and placed his hands on her shoulders. They stood together, observing their reflections in the polished metal mirror. "Colton has suggested that you might consider learning to assist in governing," Aldor said carefully. "Your listener abilities could be valuable in mediating disputes between alphas who find themselves at impasse. It would require your consent, and would be entirely your choice." Vera considered the offer. She could govern. She could use her power to shape the world shifter in ways that might have prevented her own rejection. She could become something more than a symbol or a mate. She could become a leader in her own right. The possibility was intoxicating, but she also recognized the difference between possibility and necessity. She was no longer driven by need to prove her value or reclaim her narrative. That work had already been accomplished through the confrontation with Elian. First, Vera said, I need time to simply be, to understand who I am when I am not reacting to rejection or trauma or other people's expectations. I need to learn what it means to live as Vera rather than as the Omega who was rejected, or the listener who defeated Elian or the mate of the Alpha King. After that, perhaps I will govern. Perhaps I will do something entirely different. But I need to choose from a place of genuine freedom rather than obligation or compensation for past harm. Aldor nodded, and she could see genuine respect in his expression. Respect for her refusal to be molded into a role. Respect for her insistence on authentic choice. Then that is what we will do. We will build a life where you have the luxury of becoming whoever you wish to be. They spent the evening together in companionable silence, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in each other's presence. Vera was learning that love, or whatever this connection between them actually was, did not require constant intensity or validation. It could simply be, steady and present and real. Later that night, as she drifted toward sleep in the chamber that was now fully hers, Vera thought about the decade that had passed since her rejection. She thought about her mother, about the suffering that fear and conformity had caused. She thought about Elian and his ideology of purity. She thought about the forest and the 10 years of isolation that had saved her by teaching her to survive alone, and she understood that she would not change any of it. Not truly. Every moment of pain and rejection and struggle had been necessary to become the person she was now. A person who could not be diminished by rejection because she knew her own value. A person who could resist domination because she had learned to trust her own power. A person who could choose love without losing herself within it. For the first time since childhood, Vera felt truly at home. Not in the castle, though the castle was comfortable. Not with Aldor, though his presence was grounding. Home existed within herself, in the knowledge that she was exactly as she needed to be, and that her life was now hers to shape according to her own will. The future remained unwritten, full of possibility and uncertainty. But Vera faced it without fear, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it as herself, powerful, free, and finally, completely home.